All right. My name is Melissa Nolan. I'm the environmental specialist with a focus in pollution prevention here at ECU's Center for Sustainable Energy and Environmental Engineering, and that's East Carolina University. We are presenting a webinar series today with our focus on reducing food waste in the supply chain, greenhouse gas benefits. This is funded in part by the Environmental Protection Agency. And if Dr. Thomas, you want to click next on that, thank you. Here at East Carolina University College of Engineering and Technology, we are future focused and innovation driven. ECU, and we kind of shorten our name a little bit to CSE3. We offer all sorts of different services. EPA Pollution Prevention Program is one of them. That's P2 for short. And Source Reduction Assistance. We also shorten that to SRA. So these different services we can provide includes on-site energy and lean assessments, regional and on-site P2 energy trainings, regional workshop, technical and engineering support, cash flow and market analysis, and interest on return on investment. Some webinar housekeeping today. So this series will be recorded. Speaker presentations will be available. We'll send out the copy of the PowerPoints after the presentation. At the very end of the session, we'll do a Q&A session. So feel free, if during the presentation you have questions that come up, feel free to post them in the chat, but we'll address them at the end of the webinar. And feel free to give us any feedback on things you like or things that we can improve on. Our speaker today is Dr. Valerie Thomas. She's a professor in the H. Milton School of Industrial and Systems Engineering at Georgia Institute of Technology. She's an Anderson Interface Director of Natural Systems and also holds a joint appointment in the School of Public Policy. And at this time, I'll hand it over to Dr. Thomas.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Am I coming through just fine in terms of being able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Great. So I am so pleased to have this opportunity to talk with you all today about reducing food waste. So I put in the title food waste because I think people generally understand what that means. However, in the business, technically, there are a number of terms that are used, and I'm broadly referring to all of them. So USDA, for example, in its analyses refers to food waste as the food that's leaving the human supply chain in retail or food service or in the household sector. And they use the term food loss when it leaves the food chain on the farm following harvest or in processing or in the processing or distribution center sector. Also, the US EPA uses a term excess food, and they use that term for food that is able to move into human use rather than being going to landfill or something like that. Okay, how much food loss is there? There are varying estimates. The USDA's number was 31%. EPA has also made an estimate. Making these estimates is challenging not only because there needs to be an estimate of how much food loss and waste and excess was there, but also there needs to be an estimate of the denominator of how much food supply there is exactly. So the number is in the range of 30 to 40%. This might not include some of the loss on farms. So from my perspective, there's at least 30 to 40% of the food supply that technically might be, that is being lost or wasted or is excess. Here is an estimate from an EPA document on where in the supply chain these food losses are occurring. And as you see here, 38% of that, the largest segment, is lost in manufacturing and processing. I'm especially emphasizing that because I think this seminar series and possibly some of the participants and people who are listening may be especially interested in the food manufacturing and food processing and what can be done there. So again, I want to emphasize, and I'll come back to this, that is the largest single segment of where we're having food loss and food waste. Possibly with the exception of on the farm. The second largest is residential. That may not be surprising to you, those of you who may be involved with cooking or eating food at home. The third largest area is restaurants and food services, and then there's others, the supermarkets, food wholesale, schools, office buildings, and more. Okay, what happens to this food? Here again are estimates from the US EPA. Most of it is going to landfill. The second largest part is being used for animal feed. That is food that is not going to be used for its intended use of human consumption, can be diverted to animal food. Some, just 9%, goes to food donation. There's land application that occurs mostly at the farm. There's co-digestion and anaerobic digestion that typically occurs in the farm. Well, I will get to this in a moment. There is also controlled combustion of some food waste. The US EPA has put out this food recovery hierarchy, and I'm highlighting it for just it's good to know, and also to think about in terms of what kinds of changes might be undertaken and how different actions with addressing food loss and food waste might have effects on the environment and the economy. They put at the bottom landfilling and incineration. I believe that's for a number of reasons. One, landfilling and incineration do not recover the value of the food in any way. There are also emissions from landfilling, which I'll talk about a bit later. Notice that source reduction is at the top. It's above feeding hungry people. That might surprise some people. However, I will offer, I'm not, privy to exactly how EPA came up with this, but my perspective, having just as a side activity, volunteering in food waste, food kitchens, and so on, there's a lot of loss in taking food waste and providing it to hungry people. And there is a lot of extra food. So at least my personal experience with feeding hungry people, of course, we want to do that to the extent possible. But there is so much more waste food than we're able to get to the hungry people that I concur with EPA's preference here that source reduction really should be a priority rather than sourcing extra food and trying to get it to hungry people, because the efficiency is rather low in my perspective. We can talk about that later. Okay, something that I think is kind of interesting and provides some perspective here is, well, how does EPA estimate the amount of the waste? And notice here, they don't have a major activity that's actually out there monitoring food waste. EPA's method for evaluating how much food is being wasted draws largely on studies that have been done by others at smaller scale. They use these studies to identify some factors, like what fraction is lost, and I'll cover those in just a minute. And then they extrapolate nationally. So this is how they get this. So for example, there was a study from the California EPA in 2006 about how much waste there is per employee at restaurants. It first seemed to me rather a large number, 3,392 pounds per restaurant employee per year, a huge number. On the other hand, per day, that's around 10 pounds per day, maybe a believable number. Clearly, there will be some uncertainty in this number, not included in their analysis. Then EPA multiplies by the number of restaurant employees to get its amount of 9.3 million tons of food waste per year. So I applaud EPA's analyses. That's the best we can do right now. But these, the basis for the estimates is uncertain. More studies will be done in the future, and we can expect these estimates to change as we understand in the United States, the food waste in general, as well as, of course, we hope that there will be methods for reducing the amount of food waste. So I've shown here, because I think they're interesting, some of these food waste factors. And I've highlighted right here at the top the estimates of industrial food waste. That is food waste in the manufacturing and processing of food. The EPA's estimate is based on pounds of food waste per dollar of sales per year, and the number is 0.09. So a couple of interesting things about that. One, there's a lot of uncertainty here. It's interesting what the metric is, pounds per dollar of sales per year, based on studies that have been done. It would be wonderful if we had more studies. Those of you who are listening, think about doing some more studies if you can. There are more studies and more numbers available. On residential waste, 340 pounds per household per year, 70% of the food waste is lost. These are based on studies from the literature, as I said. Commercial includes supermarkets, supercenters, food wholesale, and hospitality, including hotels, restaurants, and so on. There are just interesting results here in these different sectors. Notice that what EPA has gone with in its analysis is a little bit lower than the example I just showed you, but still around 3,000 pounds per employee per year working in food service. So that's the kind of information that we have. And I believe I have one more along these lines. Yes, institutional, again, just interesting data of the amount of food waste we have in hospitals, 653 pounds per bed per year, half a pound of food waste per meal in hospitals. These are large numbers. Military installations, correctional facilities, 1 pound per inmate per day of food waste. That's what we know. This is how the U.S. is able to make its estimates so far. Okay, so then when there is excess food, terminology of the U.S. EPA, of food that goes to being consumed by humans, and food waste, meaning that it is not consumed by humans, here I've pulled out the fate of food from manufacturing and processing. So here, notice that unlike, as I said earlier, when I was showing that most food waste goes to landfill, but not most, but that's the largest fate for it in general. From the food manufacturing and processing sector, the largest fate is for animal feed. And the second largest is land application. So in some ways, that's good news. Both animal feed is a beneficial use, and land application can also have benefits for the land, especially if it's farmland. And many of these, landfilling is very small. Many of these others have beneficial impacts. Food donation, so that is excess food going to people. Co-digestion and anaerobic digestion can produce energy that is used productively in the economy. In comparison, in the residential sector, most of the waste goes to landfill. The other goes to controlled combustion. That is what used to be called municipal waste incinerators, and a little bit of composting. Here is what's called a Sankey diagram, showing the same things that I've been talking about, but connecting the sources of the waste with the fate of food waste. So you can see, again, same stuff, just shown in a prettier and clearer way. That manufacturing and processing food waste goes mostly to animal feed and land application, whereas residential goes mostly to landfills. Restaurants goes a lot to landfills, but some to food banks, and food retail also going to food banks. So this provides a fuller picture of these sources and where it's going in the US now. What I will allude to a little later, so let's just look at it right now. There are greenhouse gas emissions, one of the impacts of food waste from the production and processing and also end of life of food waste. Landfilling has a particularly large greenhouse gas impact, and most of the landfilled food waste is coming from residential waste, not so much from the manufacturing and processing. So something this means is that when manufacturing and processing waste is reduced, notice it's the largest amount of the food waste shown here. When it's reduced, the greenhouse gas benefits, in fact, might be smaller than reducing food lost in the residential sector, even though the residential sector is a somewhat smaller amount of food loss than manufacturing and processing. Here again are data on how the US EPA and I think, yeah, US EPA has estimated some of these different sources of food waste. I am expecting that over time, as there's more attention on measuring food waste, that these numbers and methodologies will improve, they'll get more complicated, and we'll learn more. All right, so now I'm going to switch more fully for a little bit to looking at greenhouse gas emissions from food waste. Before I say this, let me clarify that greenhouse gas emissions are far from the only impact, and probably not the largest impact, of food waste. There are, both in the United States and globally, many people who do not get enough to eat. There is food going to waste that could support people in just their basic need. More broadly, throughout the food production system, the economics are tight for farmers, are tight for food workers. If we could better utilize the food that we have to support the livelihood of farmers and farm workers, that would be a benefit. And looking forward into the future, just the capacity of our farmers globally to produce food needed for all the people, it comes into question. I think that we can do it, that the ability to provide food for people is well within our means, but reducing food waste will have benefit in the future. That said, food waste also has substantial greenhouse gas emissions. And we're in the middle of a conference of the parties right now addressing climate change. Reducing food waste can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that's a area of greenhouse gas reductions that just has wide acceptability across the spectrum. Okay. Here is a figure. It's actually from the EPA's WARM model. That is their model for waste reduction. And specifically, it's a model for beef. They have similar figures and similar analyses for many food categories, and they actually look very much the same. What this is showing is the supply chain of beef. To make beef, raw materials are needed, livestock needs to be managed, beef needs to be processed, there's transport to the retail facility, there is product use, there's the management in retail or in the home or in the end use. And then there is end of life for waste beef, which is what I'm addressing here. I'm not addressing beef as a food product, but waste. And the EPA has modeled multiple different fates for beef, as an example, and that includes landfilling. It includes combustion, as in what might be called a municipal waste incinerator or other kind of waste incinerator. There is composting and there is anaerobic digestion. Each of these can have greenhouse gas emissions. Notice here the key that the blue is intended to mean there are positive emissions. There are emissions from all of the energy use and agricultural processes involved in beef creation. Green means there can be what are called negative emissions or benefits. And those can happen when, for instance, in landfilling, as I'll explain more in a minute, this is carbon in the form of beef, in this case, that is deposited in a landfill and sequestered. So it can be a way, not in the case of beef at large scale, but in particular, this can be a way of reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by capturing carbon dioxide in biomass and landfilling it. It's shown it's a positive and a negative here because the landfill also has substantial emissions. But in other cases, such as anaerobic digestion, it's possible to create a methane fuel that can have positive impacts. Composting can absorb carbon into the compost, increase the amount of carbon that soil provides, that soil sequesters, and can be a net positive. So, in summary, the point of this slide is generally to indicate that in the production of food, there is all the life cycle stages tend to emit some carbon dioxide, and different ways of disposing of waste typically have some greenhouse gas emissions, but they're different depending on the emissions, and that the US EPA has a well-developed model for all of these kinds of food waste in which it's possible to make comparisons of the different end-of-life choices. One of those choices in the model includes what they call source reduction. That allows to compare with producing beef that somehow ends up being wasted and going to a landfill with just not producing that beef, which would then involve not having all of these emissions. So reducing food waste, if there's source reduction, reduces the emissions from production, as well as reducing emissions from the end use. All right, this is a fun concept here, which is biogenic carbon. You may be familiar because it's discussed in a great deal in the press and in universities, that when we combust fossil fuels, gasoline, other petroleum fuels, natural gas, coal, the carbon in these fuels releases energy when we burn them. That's why we burn them. And the form of the carbon doesn't disappear, it becomes carbon dioxide. It may not be visible, it is not visible, but it is carbon dioxide, and that goes into the atmosphere. These fossil fuels are called fossil fuels because they are fossils. They are typically 400 million years old or thereabouts. So when we combust them, they go into the atmosphere. There is a carbon cycle. Slowly, this carbon dioxide will be absorbed into the ocean and gradually back into the earth, but that takes thousands of years. So burning a fossil fuel, we're a net emission to the atmosphere. And that's most of the conversation about climate change and increasing greenhouse gases these days. However, our food is different because we grow our food and then eat it in a relatively small amount of time, like within usually 1 year. So when food grows, it grows because the plants are absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that's what makes the carbohydrates in the plants. And then if this is animal food, the cows, for instance, eat the plants, and that becomes their body. And then when this food decays, or even when it's put into a landfill, it will decay into carbon dioxide again, and it can be emitted from the landfill, or if by some chance the food is simply thrown out and sits on the ground like a banana peel, it will decay. It will release carbon dioxide. But generally speaking, I'm speaking here somewhat simplistically and we can have more questions, these carbon dioxide emissions are not counted as contributing to increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide, because this is part of a short-term cycle of growing food every year, absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then releasing that carbon dioxide at the end of its life. All right, for this reason, even landfills, there's carbon dioxide seeping out of those landfills because of the biomass inside the landfills that's slowly degrading. It comes out. We don't count it as increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide, again, because this is a short cycle of growing food and releasing. Similarly, as I speak, I am emitting carbon dioxide. All of us as we breathe are emitting carbon dioxide. We don't count that, not because it's small, but because this is the carbon that we recently ate as food, and then we are breathing it out again as carbon dioxide. On the other hand, there are other molecules that also affect climate. Not only carbon dioxide, also, I'm really only going to talk about this one. It's listed here as CH4. That's called methane. It's also called natural gas. I'll just mention here nitrous oxide, N2O. That one, there's quite a bit of that emitted from agriculture, both from soils, partially from use of nitrogen fertilizers, but also as just a natural part of the nitrogen cycle of growing foods. All right, back to this. Methane is a strong greenhouse gas. Notice here, this is showing how do we compare? How do we compare carbon dioxide, always talking about that in burning fossil fuels, versus methane or CH4? What all of these models, all of the ones that are widely used, is they consider the global warming potential on a 100-year time frame. So people will say that methane, looking here, has about 30 times the climate impact on a kilogram per kilogram basis compared to carbon dioxide, shown here. Okay, that's considering the impact of methane compared to carbon dioxide over the next 100 years. Recently, some people have been considering that we should perhaps be considering climate impacts over a shorter time period, over 20 years. This column here shows the relative impact of methane over this shorter time period. And what it shows is that compared to here, where these numbers, I'll talk about why there are two numbers in a minute, are roughly 30 times as bad as CO2. On a shorter time frame, it's more like 80 times as bad. Why is that? There's two things going on at the same time. One thing is that the radiative forcing, the impact of methane on our climate, the amount of the sun's radiation and the heat from the earth that is being absorbed by methane, is radiative efficiency larger by a good bit. If you compare these technical numbers, it's larger than CO2. But on the other hand, whereas carbon dioxide, it's a stable molecule and it stays in the atmosphere for a long time until it's absorbed by the ocean or plants on land, methane only lasts about 12 years in the atmosphere before it degrades actually to carbon dioxide. So all in all, increasingly, some scientists are saying that it's good to look at this 100-year time frame in which methane is 30 times as bad as CO2, but also really for efforts to to reduce the impact of greenhouse gases sooner, within 20 years, we should really be looking at the effect over 20 years, in which case methane emissions are 80 times as bad. In other words, approximately 3 times worse than how we're considering them now. What that means is that the benefits of reducing greenhouse gases, of reducing methane, may be even 3 times better than people have been generally considering. I realize this is complex. I just want you to know it's out there. So it might be that in coming years, the impacts of methane will be considered to be larger than generally discussed today. Before I move off of this whole set of numbers here, let me also talk about, there's this one fossil and there's this one non-fossil, and why are they different? They're different because if it's methane from fossil carbon, as I said, after about 12 years, the methane in the atmosphere will degrade to being carbon dioxide. If it's fossil natural gas, fossil methane, then it's still a net addition to the atmosphere. Whereas if this was methane that came from food degrading, non-fossil carbon, because this was food that was just the plants absorbed the carbon dioxide just months or maybe a year ago, then it's part of that shorter term cycle. So its net addition will be somewhat lower. So there are these two numbers, but for our purpose, they're very similar. Okay. You may also see, I am not discussing, that there are multiple different ways as shown here for thinking about how does one kind of molecule affect climate compared to another. This is just a heads up that I think over coming years, people will be discussing these more. And it's not because, oh, well, the uncertainties are because there's uncertainties, but there are these different metrics, not because we don't know whether we should be thinking about 20 years or 100 years. It's that these effects of molecules happen over time. So it's climate change is not just one number and one effect, but effects that happen over time, and different molecules will have different effects over different times. Notice also, just for fun, I'm not talking about them today, but the nitrous oxide has a much higher number. It's emitted in much smaller amounts. And then some of these are just whopping numbers, 7,380 times as bad. So these are mostly industrial chemicals that I believe may be discussed in other seminars in this series. That's all I want to say about this. That was a lot. Okay, landfills. What's the impact of landfilling? I just showed here fruits and vegetables, and I made this chart myself, so it's not as pretty as the others. Different landfills are different. When you put fruits or vegetables or other foods in a landfill, it will generally decay over time. And as I said before, some of it decays to carbon dioxide, and we don't even count it when it comes out. What I didn't say yet is that often, especially because conditions in a landfill are anaerobic, you get methane being produced, about half methane, half CO2, and that comes out. So when the methane comes out, that is considered, and it is a contribution to changing the atmosphere that wouldn't have happened if we didn't have these landfills. So that is the impact of landfills. The US EPA requires most landfills to have systems to recover this landfill gas. So if it's not recovering landfill gas, the emissions in carbon dioxide equivalents, that is using those kinds of numbers that I was showing in the previous slide, it's about 1.5 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent emitted for every kilogram that's deposited in a landfill if it's not controlled. But in the US, pretty much all active significant landfills for municipal waste and that are receiving food do have landfill gas recovery. The most common is just to recover that gas. It doesn't recover it all, but they get about half of it, and then flare it. That means to burn it. So the methane gets converted to carbon dioxide, which is, again, this short rotation carbon dioxide. There's some cases in which that landfill gas, which is methane, after all, it's natural gas, is used either to as a natural gas fuel for trucks, or as a source of electricity, or for process heat for industrial use. And there's some that are better and some that are worse, but you get your numbers down much more by more like typically a factor of 0.6 or 0.45 kilograms per kilogram. So really good landfills can do a better job. We can get the landfill gas and, from my perspective, use it as a fuel to displace using fossil fuels, get some economic benefit from the emissions from these landfills. And of course, if there is less food going to the landfills, then we can expect less emissions. Okay, it so happens that this very week, December 4th of 2023, that was this week, The FDA and USDA and EPA released a proposed national strategy to reduce U.S. food loss and waste. I provided the link right here. Part of this is addressing the reductions in methane, which I've just been discussing, as well as, of course, the tremendous benefits we can get from reducing food waste. One of the objectives in the plan is to optimize the harvest or collection of raw food. Where again, here they're showing that agricultural production is about 30% of the loss of food, and 42% is in the consumption phase. So there's a tremendous amount we can do there. The other is to reduce food loss in food manufacturing, processing, storage, and distribution. That I want, and so this is the loss part, not the waste part, which is farther down in the supply chain. And I want to focus here, I know that we're coming to the end of our hour, so I want to focus specifically on this because this group and this seminar series is especially useful for the manufacturing and processing sector for food. USDA is proposing to provide small business support, manufacturing innovation support, and to promote packaging improvements to reduce food waste. So, closing in on what can manufacturers do to reduce food loss in their processing. So I first want to state that this is different from what has been done before in pollution prevention for food manufacturers. There's been a lot of excellent work done on pollution prevention in food processing and manufacturing. It has primarily seemed to address, and surely I'm wrong, but primarily to address other kinds of like heat recovery fluids or different kinds of pollutants that are emitted from the manufacturing, but not the reduction of the primary food per se. It's also different from energy efficiency in the manufacturing and processing of food. Also tremendously important, but that has to do with, how much energy is being used in the manufacturing, which is different from how much of the food supply are we losing in the manufacturing. So one of the first recommendations, and here this is in the food loss prevention options manufacturing that EPA has developed, is really straightforward. Conduct a waste audit. Perform a food waste audit. What's being thrown out, weight or number of items, the reasons, and so on. So that's one of the first steps, very similar to what was recommended in the seminar on Tuesday on manufacturing in other sectors. Second is to clarify date labeling and date encoding to reduce confusion from consumers. There is a lot of food that is thrown away because people will see either an expiration date on their food product or just a best by a certain date. Some people will interpret they should throw it away and not eat it after that. So there is quite a bit of thought that can go into care in the labeling to ensure that it's correct and provides information, but doesn't lead to unnecessary food waste at the consumption part of the process. And finally, there is a set of recommendations to reduce food loss, and that includes promoting short supply chains, increasing communication with the retailers and the suppliers to make sure that food is not being sent to them that will be wasted, to consider size requirements, send order estimates more frequently, And especially these cuts and ends, there are other materials that are food that are becoming waste in the manufacturing process, to find ways to use those to as food and not as waste. I will close with a comment that in comparison with standard pollution prevention activities and with energy efficiency in manufacturing, food loss prevention in the food manufacturing and processing sector has quite a bit of opportunity for development. I'm applauding your center for beginning to focus on this issue, and I encourage those who are listening to this and their friends to do more work to support food loss prevention in manufacturing and supply. And with that, I close my formal remarks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. That was so enlightening, and one of the NEA sectors that, CSE3 serves is food and beverage manufacturing. So quite interesting things going on there. But could we pull up that last slide there? Sorry.
Yes, I will share my screen again, and I will go right back to where I think we were. This one?
Yes, thank you so much. So I know with the holidays coming up, we're all getting kind of busy, but we do have CSE3 does have lots of other webinars focused on pollution prevention coming up. So feel free, if you scan the QR code there and follow us. That's a link tree to all our social medias. We'll post different flyers and different events going on, including educational courses and webinars such as this one. Please follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, all that good stuff to keep along with all the other educational events coming up in the new year. And I just want to thank everyone for being able to meet today. And at this time, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. And also I'll put Dr. Thomas's contact information on our follow-up email as well. So if you feel more comfortable talking with her there, that is another access point.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
So I am curious, Melissa, or others of you there, if your center has worked directly with food manufacturers on reducing food loss in their operations.
I would deter that question to more of our engineers who have worked directly with those manufacturers. That's definitely consideration. We have made, I know I can say for sure, we've made suggestions on how to, let's say there is a food waste product and they're just putting it in the landfill. We've recommended they connect and have made those connections with farmers and different folks, maybe to use that waste as feed. But yeah, we have made those types of recommendations, definitely on a case-by-case basis, depending on the food producer. But yes, it is something we'll look at in the life cycle. All right, we do have some questions coming through. Let's see here. Patricia says, thank you for the amazing talk. There is a big hype lately on making biomaterials and biofuels out of food waste. How sustainable do you think these end-of-life options are, and how do they compare with the BAU end-of-life options?
Thank you for that very nice question. I think it's a great option to use food waste or agricultural waste or so on to make fuels and chemicals and other products. The one big challenge is, although I've been saying how large the amount of food waste is, compared to the amount of fuel that's kind of cost effective to make, these are really small scale. And so they don't fulfill the full need of the United States for renewable fuel, and it's hard to make them cost effective. Even so, I think it's something that should be strongly pursued because it helps build the supply chain for that could, in future years become larger with different kinds of resources. One other thing I want to say is that there have, however, been some cases in which, I'll just say dairy, for example, that there might be methane emissions and strategies for selling carbon credits from capturing methane emissions. So there are some care is needed in thinking about what kinds of emissions are and aren't regulated, and just being careful with assuming that there can be carbon credits for that and how all of that works out.
Awesome. And Jean is asking, are you aware of any study about the extent that food manufacturers have voluntarily moved to best if by used by date labeling?
So thank you for the wonderful question. The answer is no, and I hope that you'll do that the amount of work in this area should be larger.
There's many debates in my household when those type of dates come up on food products on, do we get rid of it or not? So yeah, some clarity from the industry would be wonderful.
Oh, let me say one last thing. NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology, has had a marvelous 3-day seminar series on food waste and loss. So kudos to them, tremendous. And I hope their materials will be made available to everyone who may not have been aware of this and so has missed it all.
Awesome. Well, I think that's it for today, but thank you all for joining us, and please be on the lookout for my follow-up email, and please join CSE3 for our future pollution prevention focused webinars.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. All right. Goodbye.
Thank you.